All right, Jon, since moments before the show, I saw you feverishly moving around candlesticks and decor behind you. I'm just so grateful that you're tablescaping for the show, so you get to go first. Let's start with Jack Smith. Some people may have forgotten about Jack, but he didn't forget about us. What sticks out to you? Yes?
I was just going to say, my wife, Stephanie, also named Stephanie, would kill me if she had gone out and gotten the skull and the pumpkin and it hadn't shown up in the shot.
Well, I love them both. You know, Halloween is my favorite, I almost said favorite sport, favorite holiday. So thank you to Stephanie. Okay, let's talk about Jack Smith. I want to know what stuck out to you in the filing, and do you think it's going to have any effect on the 2024 race?
So first of all, what sticks out in the filing, I think, is where the fight will be, which is over the discussions that Donald Trump had with Vice President Mike Pence and whether those things are allowable as part of a prosecution, given that the Supreme Court has made this distinction, basically saying that the official acts of a president are not things that he can be held accountable for by prosecutors. So then the question is, which of the conversations between Vice President Pence and President Trump, when President Trump was trying to get him to overturn the results of the 2020 election, might be admissible? And so there's a lot of discussion in this filing, 165-page filing, of just what Mike Pence told folks. In fact, I thought one of the most interesting things is that he had 5 pages of contemporaneous notes about one meeting in which the prosecutors say Donald Trump was told by a lawyer that his plan to have Pence basically reject the certification of electors was illegal. And so I think we're seeing the sort of outlines of that fight. The other big thing here, of course, is Jack Smith basically laying out his entire case against Donald Trump and, with co-conspirators, names redacted, but people know who they are, and, doing that right now before the election. So the question is that you posed about whether this is going to have an effect. I'm not sure, Stephanie, that it will have an effect. I do think it is a jarring reminder of just what happened during that period of time, but I do also think that most Americans have made up their minds about it. It's not something that they particularly want to talk about. In fact, last night, JD Vance had January 6th brought up to him, and I thought what was much more poignant, than his commentary on January 6th was the fact that he wouldn't say that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election. That the possibility of a recurrence, I think, is a lot more on the minds of voters, particularly Democratic voters, but also maybe some swing voters, than whether Donald Trump is guilty of crimes from 4 years ago. Not because the time distance is so much, but just because voters tend to look forward, not backward.
Yeah, and some are getting worried about January 6, 2025. We're going to talk about the debate in a second, but I want to talk more about news of the day. Errin, when you look at Hurricane Helene, what's happening in the Middle East, and the dock worker strike, what do you think could have the biggest impact on the election? They always talk about the October surprise. We're getting a lot, and the month has barely started.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the way that you framed this at the start of the show is exactly right. There's so much happening in the country, so much happening in the world that's bringing the stakes of this election into stark relief for many of the American people, right? I do think that, President Biden and Vice President Harris being in North Carolina and Georgia today, that was meaningful for President Biden. He's still in charge. This is what a president does after a disaster. He's going to Florida and Georgia tomorrow. To see more of the storm's impact in this region. And this is what, particularly this president is known for, given his empathy. You had former President Trump, though, in Georgia last week surveying the damage. And the thing about these trips, I mean, they are a detour from the campaign trail, but they also do really focus voters' attention on kind of the ongoing efforts to rebuild after this devastating storm in the midst of, the election season. And it shows how a president or a would-be president could behave and respond to this moment. So I think that does matter. By the way, early voting is about to begin in both of these states in the next couple of weeks as folks are still, going about the business of putting their lives back together. But with 5 weeks to go until Election Day, I mean, everything feels political. That dock worker strike that you mentioned puts the issue of workers' rights back into the election conversation. Labor is a huge constituency for both Trump and Harris. And even if you're not in a union, that supply chain issue. I mean, experts say it might not affect people immediately, but depending on how long this lasts, this could be something that affects people who are not necessarily, a part of a dock worker who is trying to push for, better conditions for themselves, this could be something that's affecting a lot more people across the country.
Absolutely. 4 or 5 weeks from now, people are walking in the grocery store. If the produce section is empty, if things are really expensive, they are going to look to the administration and say, this isn't working for me, despite the fact that the president, there's little he can do on this. And at this point, he has said he doesn't want to get in the middle of it. Molly, let's talk about the debate last night, right? This time last night, there was hot takes everywhere. It has now been 24 hours. Coolers' heads have prevailed. What is yours thinking?
Well, it's interesting because it's almost as if the pundits all said right after it happened that Vance had won because he was smoother. He was able to get a lot out very quickly. A lot of it not true, but very smooth and very fast, like someone who has had a lot of experience debating. Meanwhile, Walz was looked a little bit scared and pale. Perhaps it was a moment for bronzer. No, I'm just kidding. And there was this sort of knee-jerk reaction that perhaps Vance, by lying so effectively and being so, sort of congenial in a certain way, may have sold Trumpism without Trump, which has been sort of the long dream of the Republican Party. But I do think, since it's been 24 hours, we're seeing that actually a lot of voters really liked Walz better. And you even saw that on the right, he was, there's a statistic that sort of 25% of the right-wing-ish voters who watched it found they liked Walz. So, that Midwestern nice, I actually do think translated, and maybe he didn't get quite all the hits in, maybe, and he was maybe not able to provide the real-time fact check in the way that in an ideal world he would have been able to. But his personality still transmitted in a way that voters liked. And I do think Vance, if you want to spend time being worried, you could worry about that Vance was able to make Trumpism without Trump seem a little bit more possible. And I think that might have implications for 2028.
All right, well, then lay it out, Errin, because JD Vance came across smart, quick, and capable. But as Molly just said, the things he was saying smoothly, fast, speedily, and capably, they were filled with lies, right? He lied about the nationwide abortion ban. He lied about the Affordable Care Act. He wouldn't confirm the outcome of the last election. So which matters more to swing voters? And I cringe when I say swing voters because I don't know if I believe there are any swing or undecideds left. But I leave it to you.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think both candidates kind of pretty much met expectations if we're evaluating them, right? I think that we knew that debating was JD Vance's strong suit. Tim Walz said that he was not the best debater, but what we think as journalists, as pundits, is not necessarily the same thing that voters think, to Molly's point. Which one of these candidates was the one that voters found more relatable, right? I mean, former President Trump is really the only person out of the four people that we've now seen in a debate setting that the American people really are very familiar with. The rest of these candidates are still very much trying to introduce themselves to the American people. And so I think we've now had a chance to see all four candidates in a debate setting, and it's unclear whether we will again. But I do think, having more interviews with Vance and Walz would be helpful. And I think that what they also do just on the campaign trail over the next 5 weeks is probably going to matter a lot more than what we saw last night.
John, isn't that funny? The rise of Donald Trump in politics, we kept hearing over and over. He doesn't speak like a politician. He's not slick. He's not quick. He just speaks like a regular old person, and that connects with people. That's exactly what we said about Tim Walz last night, and he was criticized for it. And when Democrats are slick and fast and cool and elites from Ivy League schools, they get crushed for it, and that's exactly who JD Vance is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess, I would look at Barack Obama and say, he was the guy who was pretty smooth and quick and adroit on his feet and had an Ivy League education. And, Democrats loved him and a lot of independents loved him. I would say this, though, Stephanie, I think that there was an implicit rejection of Donald Trump last night, which is we saw a normal debate, a civil debate, a debate where both candidates expressed compassion for people who don't share their political affiliation, who don't agree with them on policy. And that in and of itself is really the first time we've seen a debate like that in, I don't know, about a decade now since Trump got on the scene. I also think that while it's interesting to watch and while there are permission structures created, say for on the Republican side for people who are already leaning toward Trump but don't love everything he says to look at Vance and feel a little more comfortable about their vote. Nobody in this country is voting in this election based on these vice presidential candidates. If you don't know how you feel about Donald Trump, love him or hate him, if you don't know how you feel about Kamala Harris, love her or hate her, you missed the movie, Steph. Like that's what people are going to vote on. It will not be like, folks going, well, I really like the cut of that JD Vance's jib, so forget it. Forget all those things I dislike about Donald Trump. Or, man, Tim Walz, he's so friendly. He's kind of like my dad. I like him better and think he'd be a better president than Kamala Harris. I mean, there's nobody saying that themselves.